Religion attempted to heal men's soul, government his behavior, psychiatry his mind. Guess that about covers it. All criticism begins as wonder, and all wonder begins as ignorance, and all ignorance becomes the answer to its own questions. About covers it. What? Ancient myth tells of the days when the spirit of mysticism walked the earth and announced to those who might seek its face, amidst all that is useless, look for me there. Understanding that the local is always specific and the universal not, ponder this. The body is naturally specific based, while the mind has other opportunities available to it. Carried onward, consider this. Examples are always local, and thus, no matter their apparent pertinence and exactness, can never reveal anything beyond their own boundaries, anything of an unconditional, universal nature. Applying this to men rather than just ideas, does it become clear why the more conscious tell so few personal anecdotes about themselves? The stronger the acceptance one has of their native personality, the weaker the possibilities of them ever seeing and experiencing life there beyond. Only ants, habitual inhabitants of the anthill, believe that a study thereof, more than a single initial one, holds out promise. The beauty of a view from outer space is that once you've seen one thing fully, you've seen everything. A lad asked his dad, if the truly rich never think of money, do the truly knowledgeable never think of ignorance? There was once a land where everyone knew everything, that is, except everyone but this one man. And after a time, he began to believe that he was in possession of something unknown to everyone else. The name of this land was, isn't that the way it goes? A boy inquired of his father, if there was a place where it rained all of the time, would it benefit the inhabitants to be told of sunshine? There was once a world on which everyone was their own parent and everyone was their own offspring. The name of this world was, don't I wish I could always remember that this is how things really are. Yeah. Two kinds of men take to the public, serious podium to speak. The ordinary and those who know something extraordinary. Both waste their time, but one more than the other, since they should know better. There was once a mystic who one day stopped and thought, I may be too hard on my own mind. After all, without it, I wouldn't have anybody to talk to about this. Legend says that a hunter should never shoot the last bird in the sky until he has a practical knowledge of avian production. Public myths of warriors defending their homeland while in retreat by burning the last bridge behind them are physical commandeering of what was originally a mental battle strategy. Pop-Tart quiz. If such things were visible, how could you differentiate a parade of the more conscious from an everyday one? The former variety would be sending out from their own ranks those to run up ahead of them to stand on the sidewalk, sticking out their tongues and laughing. Either that or the progression of the more conscious would still be exactly as it is now. In-friggin' visible. Moral, it's quite difficult to get people to laugh at something they already think is ridiculous. There was once a kingdom of great potential, but it remained undiscovered, hidden in the middle of every other kingdom. As he was being booted out of the garden door, Adam was asked by God whether, as a going-away consolation, he would prefer to be blinded or be fitted with a pair of glasses that distorted everything beyond belief. Those who life can't get to take drugs, it makes think in a normal fashion. After being held in confinement for a considerable time, one man managed his escape by making his straitjacket appear to be a psychiatrist's schmuck. After learning of what he had done, the mental health care professionals were, to say the least, upset. but which was nothing compared to the outrage experienced by the other patients. And by the by, if you have trouble making sense of the above, you probably possess the abilities to have a future in the mental health field, on one side or the other. From one view, you could say that the more conscious either have better sight than everyone else, or else worse, in that they can look at a thing and see only the thing. And a man asked a mystic, "Wait a minute, let me get this straight, once and for all. Is being more conscious having the ability to look at a thing and see only the thing, or to look at a thing and see how it is connected to everything else extant?" And the mystic replied, "Now you're getting it." Which, if you're interested, is about what the man was afraid he'd say. Life pours a ton of energy through everybody, with most of it being wasted. Not that those it's wasted on can ever realize it, but much of the energy available goes absolutely to waste. Definition: mystics, Earth's first conservationists and recyclers. A man once asked a transcendental thinker, "Is everything old, new again?" To which the thinker replied, "Can you reverse that and it still makes sense to you?" For a blind man who's seen the sunrise and tried to describe it to his fellow sightless with no success, keeping a level of excitement related thereto can become quite a challenge. And all the little blind people said, "Aww." Even amongst one-time mystics who have aged too well, it remains true. Once a Republican, always a Republican. Another reason that travelers properly seasoned get off the first train as soon as possible. Caution: if you are prepared to go to your grave wrapped proudly in your present garb, be it known that you will die. The reason you see so few mystics embalmed is because of their already in action plans of self-resurrection. Another interesting aspect of travel on the Mystical Express is that you can't go dressed as you are now, no matter how that is. At least, mused one sojourner well into his sojourn, on this particular journey, you can't ever get your money back. Another way to look at it, as long as you are still looking at it, is that the mind deals in specific local examples, while expanded consciousness trades in all-encompassing universals. Further note, the former always requires explaining and defending, while the latter just is. One mystic order is said to have taught that every time life tells you to wait a minute, it is a test. A test, the purpose of which no one understands. So, when life says, wait a minute, your best bet is to do something or the other, or else not. Cheese quiz time. Just what is the difference between the religious's belief that life is some sort of spiritual test and a similar situation regarding the more conscious that the above touched on? Well, sir, the religious think of man's mundane existence as some sort of test to determine one's future fitness, while those on more familiar terms with life understand not to mail in box tops for prizes to any organization whose address is outside this universe. "Hey," cried a gaggle of youngsters clutching beheaded boxes of cereal, "what have we suckered ourselves into?" But never being one to be caught off guard, napping or otherwise unprepared, life immediately calmed their festering testiness by saying, "Wait a minute." And them, continuing to be the alert little devils they are, they hesitated but a moment, then said, "Okay." The sensation of progress within the overall mortal parade is maintained as long as men can mentally arrange things so that, for instance, the state of being wet can be held culpable rather than the rain. And if you don't get this one either, welcome to the parade. Looking around one day, one man was struck by this thought regarding death. Something funny is afoot when one of the things that gets the living most excited is the idea of not living. Would anyone on the blue team care to take this idea and find some application thereof to how men ordinarily get excited in their thinking? And the little kid with glasses, second from the end, said that he might give it a try, but only if his school would get some new computers or sports equipment if he was correct. You know, you got to admire a little smart ass like that. There's a legend that tells of one mystical school which never spoke of any matter other than the specifically mystical. They never addressed any aspect of ordinary human existence, only matters directly and solely mystical. Legend goes on to say that such a school never existed long enough to actually exist outside of legend. Legend does add, however, that you're free to ponder this matter further. The tale of the mighty warrior. Once upon a time there was a mighty warrior who unhesitatingly for many years attacked any and all possible targets. But then the day came when he wearied of such efforts. But what could he do? After all, he was a warrior. The end, at least according to legend. To help hold his seat on the train of transcendency, one man strove to hold in his mind at all times the number 1. Then after he had traveled some years, attempting to secure his continued seating by keeping in mind at all times, then after he had traveled some years, attempting to secure his continued seating, he then tried to keep in mind at all times the number 2. And after a few years thus spent and feeling himself to have made some real progress, he decided to either temporarily cease thinking of numbers or change seats. Note, those born Republican can scarce bear the thought of becoming Democrat. Way back when men had dumber ideas, some believed that squinty little eyes was a sure sign of stupidity. Of course, what made this actually dumb was that they were spelling eyes incorrectly. One man's mind said, "I squint, therefore I am." In reaction to the world moving too quickly as they perceived it, one band of trees began making their home in the tops of squirrels. And another man's mind said, "It is nourishment such as that on which I cannot survive." One way to tell when a mystic is calling for help is by all the silence you hear. There was once a man who came to understand so much that he tore off his glasses, ripped out his hearing aid, threw away his wooden leg, and commenced to collapse on the ground, deaf and unable to see where he was. The reason so few mystics believe in good luck is because of the hidden cost involved. Mental shopping by mail. Although death has your final package to deliver, between now and then, sleep continues to call to make sure you're still at home. All civilizations began as dreams. All religions as drugs. So what does all mysticism start out as? And if you don't know the answer, you're getting close. While ordinary men sometimes pass along the insult one to another that you couldn't think your way out of a paper bag, those of extended awareness are striving to become mental paper bags. In a faraway, fantastic kingdom was once a man of firm convictions and opinions who was of such mental sensitivity that he was extraordinarily easy to intellectually offend. And this man, this very same man, was never elected king. Life is in radio contact with all areas of the universe. And on some planets it broadcasts on 2 separate bands, like AM and FM, whereby it sends out one signal to the inhabitants' feet and another to their heads. After hearing of this, one man tried to do the same thing in his own mind. a man pondered, what can cause excitement other than hunger, fear, or dreams? And not being able to think of any more, decided there weren't enough for him to start talking to people about them trying to become more conscious. One man agreed to bring the birthday cake and presents, but said that others would have to blow out the candles and open them. And in appreciation, the would-be partygoers told him not to bother. The distinction between the mystical express and routine trains is that the mystical pulls up its own tracks behind itself to use as fuel to go on forward. One version of the story says that Adam left the original Garden of Paradise of his own choosing, after God told him he was going to have to start providing his own entertainment and excitement. From our continuing philosophical dictum updating, those standing squarely in the middle of contemporary life say, I think, therefore I think I'm enthused. While the more conscious feel, I think anew and have therefore refreshed myself into another level of excitement. If you don't change your underwear, you can't change your hat. And if you don't clean out the basement, the penthouse will stay cluttered. And since there's no way you can change your underwear while your hat's on, or clean out the basement while the upstairs is still cluttered, what can one do? And of course the answer is, for the saint and ordinary, nothing. There is nothing that can be done. But not quite good enough for the few who've been able to back off and get a better view. While something may be sequentially and spatially impossible in one dimension and can be otherwise in another, while something may be sequentially and spatially impossible in one direction, it can be otherwise in another. Why else you think that transcendental realms exist? If they do. And even if they don't. They only don't in the dimensions in which they seem to don't. Ergo, even in worlds where you can't change your hat till you've changed your underwear, and where you can't change your underwear while your hat's on, magicians in the know can still take off their vest without removing their coat. The danger and joy, I might add, to being the last car on the train leaving town is that someone will always take a shot at you, if you're lucky. How to identify the incurably dumb. They take being dumb seriously. A certain mystic once went to see a doctor just to complain about the magazines in his waiting room. And after being encouraged by the experience, he then went on to do something similar to himself regarding his own mental antechamber. In an attempt to bring about a new sense of intellectual balance, one man fired a bullet into the area of his left frontal lobe, only to miss and hit himself most painfully in the clavicle, which did result in better weight distribution in his shoulders, but did nothing to improve his opinionated mental posture. Of course, added one man, there is yet another way to spot the incurably dumb, which is by the fact that they even misspell the word dumb, such as I just did. The reason you see so few mystics committing suicide is because you see so few of them alive to begin with. How to learn secrets not known to normal men. There are two ways to go about this. The first way is to listen and learn from other people. And the second way is to learn some other way. No. Is it any wonder that education remains the popular pastime it is? And now, just in time for the holidays, yet another definition of those ever-popular creatures, the mystics. Mystics, those who always and everywhere open their presents early. And here again, if needed, is additional proof that everyone else is much smarter than mystics. There was once a man who pulled on his own fake beard only to find, guess what, underneath? and he said he'd never do that again. Obviously not part of the jolly old saint know-it-all school. Life looks as much to man for mental procreation as it does physical. This presently is so on the collective level rather than the individual. The secret is not seen in pieces. All pieces of it can be seen, but it is not to be found in the piecemeal specifics that the mind locally makes of the universal. In the city, buildings age from the top down, while in the country, barns crumble from the bottom up. What this says regarding how the more alert should turn the pages is at least that they shouldn't fall victim to either of the above. You can build on a hill or build in a valley, but the juice of life still runs through the heart. At least one of the benefits of being sick is that you have getting well to look forward to. A boy born into a family of mystics was a bit miffed in that as he was growing up, they never went anywhere. With a sense of mystery, many men can longer retain a sense of mental excitement, another advantage the ordinary have over the more conscious. Beings born on Venus to further awaken must go to Mars, but then they must come back home. Once upon a time, in a land far away, there was a clown who wearied of his clowning and decided he'd take on the appearance of a mystic. Also in that distant kingdom was a mystic who wearied of being a mystic and decided he'd take on the appearance of a clown. And then one day they met face to face on a one-person pathway, and now, being unable to tell themselves one from the other, they merged into a single happy entity and disappeared. Once you accept a specific mental area as being a relevant field of conflict, you will then of necessity defend a local position thereon and be oblivious to its placement within the universal. Nearby daggers do men use to blind themselves to faraway sights. According to a just-released report, one researcher claims to have discovered a neurotransmitter which is produced by talk and which in turn distorts normal thought patterns. There was once an order of knights who only attacked red dragons, but inasmuch as they lived in a crimson world, no dragons did they ever find. When mystics go wandering, not only did they take along whiskey in case of snake bite, but also a snake. The tale of mighty minds. In the land of city giants, the weak and simple can withstand any assault other than ridicule. The people of one city began to sing to a mystic, "Please don't talk about us when we're gone," then suddenly stopped, suddenly realizing it was not them, but the mystic who was leaving. By distinguishing action from the actor, men attempt something very specific besides what we've already mentioned. When I say specific, I am now expanding it, not a local example anymore, but the more universal reality behind the individual examples that I can pull out, such as, if you recall, the more civilized you are, the more up-to-date you are, the more you're inclined to find culpable alcoholism rather than someone who is an alcoholic, to condemn crime rather than criminals. Now, in this distancing between the action and the actor, what men are unknowingly attempting to do is to separate their past from their future. They are attempting to separate their intrinsic self from their mental. Several nights back, when I was first mentioning this, I also pointed out how easy it would be from one view, and it's already been done, to attack as being frivolous, being insane, being fuzzy-headed, to find fault, to even distinguish crime from criminals, or drug addiction from drug addicts. And at that time, after I went through several views of it to show you how it works in tandem as always, that there must be opposition to whatever any prevailing or any viable idea is at any particular time. I was also pointing out that it was necessary in man's present condition for him to press onward. That was about all that was mentioned at that time, but now I'm getting into trying to get you to consider what are the dynamics of it being in such a way. Let's go back and take right quick that kind of position, which is not unfounded any more than the opposition opinion is not any more ill-founded than the prevailing sophisticated opinion and view. That is that criminals are not the problem, crime is. That is, the individual actors are not particularly responsible. That it's some kind of overall problem in which we all share. What they have done verbally and then mentally, or based on in which direction you're capable of seeing it first, that they are separating behavior from the actor. And to get this going, take the view that is already nothing, neither one is right or wrong, but there's already the opposing view. This has become so widespread, so prevalent, that there is now opposing view pointing out that that is ridiculous. It's an attempt to let people off the hook for some reason. It's just foolish, that people must be held accountable. Men cannot be held accountable in the way in which that kind of opposition would hold. That is to say that we are serving no purpose other than to make some theoretician glad somewhere. We're accomplishing nothing by letting people be relieved of their personal responsibility. Those who take drugs, that they must be held responsible. Those that engage in criminal behavior, they must be held responsible. They must be pointed out that, by God, you did it, you're responsible. Crime's not the problem, criminals are. That's, from one view, that sounds quite valid. But the more, in man's present condition, the further he goes, as far as he can go in this condition, the more that must be true. The more do men attempt mentally to distinguish, to distance themselves, to distance the actor from the action. But now here's what's involved, is that they are attempting to separate their past from their future. Or if you would like it a little more specific, they are attempting to separate their past from their potential future, as they theorize it to be. And here's the way that plays out. For someone to speak of crime as being the problem and not criminals. See, criminals represent the past. Criminals represent in man his old instinctive self, which is, if you had to give a title of either one, if you had to label man's instinctive, man's baser, man's older self down the nervous system below the conscious level, if you had to describe that as being one of these two, either civil or uncivil, either civil or criminal, it is criminal. If you had to do one or the other, it is certainly criminal, because it would take anything it wanted, as long as it could forcibly take it. It has no conscience, it has no thinking. It is simply, on that basis, criminal. To be civilized, to have your primary seat of authority have your primary sensation of you higher up the nervous system, the more you are inclined to think and to behave civilly. That it is not just the laws and the physical enforcement thereof that keeps the more civil, civil. They do it themselves. They do it through the pressure of life. And so to them, the past is criminal. And when you speak of a criminal, a person, you are speaking, without realizing it, if you're ordinary, you're speaking of the past. And so to say that to distinguish, as people do now, the more civilized, to make a distinction between behavior and the one who acts out the behavior is an attempt mentally to distance men from their past. That those who do that are being driven by life without them realizing it to try and put further and further distance between their old self, which would be criminal, and their possible future. And the possible future is represented by their descriptions, by them holding responsible action and not the actor. I know it's getting verbally sticky. Like all of it, it is simple as duck shit, except it is also as slippery and ill-suited to verbal handling. For people to speak, for people to say that the greatest problem that we face in modern times is crime. This crime, they say that instead of that our greatest threat is criminals, or that one of the great pressures tearing at the fabric of society is drug addiction, not drug addicts. In other words, over here we have behavior, and over here we have the actor. Over here we have the action. Alcoholism, criminal behavior, drug addiction, that's the action. And over here would be the actor, the criminal, the drug addict, the alcoholic. When this hand, speaking of the action, what that represents is the possible future, because they are attempting to relieve man of his criminal past, of his intrinsic, less than conscious, less than civil, less than admirable past. All right, how about this? If you think of a line, which I've drawn out diagrams before, that this is not just a overall historical progression, because the progression, the division into the simple and the past and the more complex and the sophisticated exist right now on the planet and exist within individual men to varying degrees. But right now, when you get, if we were dealing with the more simple on this planet, the less educated, none of these terms actually fit, as you should know by now, or guess. That's why I keep bringing in so many synonyms. The less sophisticated, the less complex, the less educated, the more simple on this planet, the less civilized. If you dealt with them, if we went to them and you tried to talk to them about the concepts of criminal behavior, of crime being a societal problem, rather than speaking of criminals, and you talk to them about that, they above all would dismiss it if they followed it all what you were saying. And they go, that's foolishness. If that's what you people are doing over in the civilized world, you know, God save us from it. Because under their conditions, there are many things involved. One does not cause the other, but just I'm trying to get you to see how the mind, when it reaches a bit more complex level and can embrace all of this, cannot see it all, because it still deals in local examples. At any rate, if we found some little group of fairly uncivilized people living out on a remote island in the South Pacific, and they were still verbal enough, and we could talk to them, and we were saying about in the United States and Western Europe, in the civilized world, that now, rather than just immediate, harsh treatment of criminals, we see it more as a problem of crime, of criminal behavior, than we do the individual criminal. And we described it to them, and all the progress we'd made, and that we no longer stone people to death, that by and large capital punishment is of decreasing interest, that now rather than just punishment, that the more civilized areas of the world are more concerned with rehabilitation, psychological help for those who've engaged in it. So if we talk to these people, they're on this little island, pretty simple, still living in fairly primitive conditions, and we describe that to them and assume they could understand it, their view would be that we're idiots. But also notice, now remember, one of these is not causing the other, it's not cause and effect, but I want you to see that we could be talking to the smartest, the mainstream of the people on that island and describe that to them, and to them it would be absolutely insanity because they cannot deal on that basis. There's only a finite number of people there. There's only a finite amount of space available. You cannot run from it. You can't hide. When someone engages in criminal behavior, when someone engages in behavior that harms his fellow man, everyone knows about it. I mean, he got drunk, or else he was sober and just came over and stole somebody's cow, hit somebody in the head and hurt them. Everybody knows he's responsible. There's no real discussion. You either see it or you don't. They cannot sit around and even contemplate the kind of views that we would describe as being the bedrock of modern society, of enlightened views toward such behavior. They have to hold each person responsible. They can't even conceive. If they followed what we described as our view now in the modern world, more sophisticated world, to them, if they followed it all, it would just be absolutely insane. On the basis that they could not do that. With a finite number of people, there's only 500 of them on the little island. You cannot, somebody starts stealing. He steals somebody's cow, and they go, well, and they try to adopt our views in general. They decide, well, wait a minute. Now, we've known him for years. He would not have done that unless something was troubling him. And so rather than them cutting off his hand or beating the crap out of him like they used to, they go, well, let's all get together and think about this. Maybe send off for a book on psychology. So the guy who did it, you know, after a few hours, he thinks, God almighty, I got away with it. So the next day he's going to steal somebody else's cow. You understand? And they understand that without going through some theoretical plotting of what may occur. They just understand immediately because they're closer to the past. They are living a more instinctive life. When you move outside that area, when you get into at least the closer to the front ranks of the en masse parade of progress of humanity, up there is a continuing, and it's always increasing, mental distancing of action from the actor, but what it is based upon is the mind of those people attempting to separate their past from their future. Therefore, now when I say the front ranks, from general views it's oftentimes described as liberals. Now, I'm just taking the ordinary description and trying to give you some idea. It's not either here nor there, and one's not better than the other, but those further back in the parade, the people on my fictional island, if they had to be labeled by modern thinkers in a political context, they would always be labeled conservative, reactionary. That is always true. It's true within an area such as here in France. If we're talking about us here in Paris, we call ourselves, most people, liberal, forward-thinking. And right here in France, which we all know is the most civilized, sophisticated, hip country on this planet. But we know if we start heading down southwest here, you get out there amongst the farmers and the cheeseheads, they become less and less liberal. That right here in the most liberal, progressive country in the world, you understand what I'm saying? Of course, tonight we're taking this in the United States, so I can always go back and pick on Mississippi or Alabama. That in a country, in an area that can be specified, that's accepted as being the most liberal, at the front ranks of civilization, even within that own country, in the same way within one individual civilized liberal person, there are, within everybody, there's an Alabama, there's a south of France, there's an island. Because your past is still alive, your instinctive self is still alive, or you would not be sitting there at your desk at Harvard on tenure in the philosophical and the philosophy department. Your instinctive self, your criminal self is still alive, or your heart would not be beating sufficient to drive enough blood to your brain to be coherent. So up in the front ranks, what I'm trying to say of just the overall collective parade of humanity, they are normally seen, normally labeled by themselves, by those in the middle of the parade, and even by those at the end of the parade. They're normally referred to in the political, social context as liberals. And by the same token, those toward the end of the parade, those in the back, are always labeled conservative. And this is not necessarily in line with whatever the political lemming of your specific area may be. It's just in general, throughout history, they're considered to be liberal as opposed to conservative. And what that represents is the liberal are those who are the mouthpieces of tomorrow. Doesn't mean that they understand it. They don't understand any more than those in the back of the parade trying to drag their feet understand why they're railing at those in the front of the parade. It's just part of the tug-of-war that keeps the parade going. It's part of the friction that makes this toy. It's going to turn it loose and it runs along. In this case, it's not a little toy car and it's not a little creature with legs on it. It's all of humanity. And you go, and then turn it loose. But its friction keeps it going. But those in the front of the parade, those normally referred to as liberal, those that normally thought of as being the more educated, they are always the mouthpieces for the future. Life makes them talk about the day when crime is a thing of the past, a day when, of course, they got all these descriptions that have no meaning. They have no more validity than the opposition does to it, but their description normally is that they dream of a day when the normal stories along such lines, when society is more just, when wealth and opportunity is more equally distributed, and so there will be no need for alcoholism, drug addiction, or crime. There they are. They're up front. They're normally the more educated. They got better haircuts, better clothes. They're in positions of intellectual authority, at least intellectual authority. And they say that, and those in the end of the parade, as represented by my fictitious island, those in the end of the parade, they hear that, and they go, you people are crazy. You're living in a dream world. You're living up there at the campus at Harvard or Princeton or Oxford. And you live in that little confinement, that one little community. And when's the last time somebody got mugged on campus? Probably never. You don't know how it is back here in the back of the parade. You don't know how it is living here in the slums of Birmingham or in the outskirts in the Delta area of Mississippi. Out here at night you wander around and things are so rough. People are hungry. People are not educated. They're not even really civilized. You got to watch your ass at all times. People are constantly, every night somebody's getting shot. Well, it's not every night, every other night, but every night two people are getting mugged to make up for the night that somebody doesn't get shot. And so to them, at that end of the parade, from that view, they think up here it's crazy. But notice what it is. They are living closer. They think about it in the future. I mean, the present. They say we're living in the real world. But what it is, relatively speaking, if you look at the whole parade, those in the back are living more, or they're living closer to the past. And those in the front are theoretically living, that is mentally living, closer to the future. And so they're always describing a world that cannot be right this second. That's their job. And those at the other end of the spectrum, at the other end of the parade, the more simplistic, are always resisting it and pointing out that it cannot be and saying, you people are crazy. You got to face the facts. And picking out the universals, by letting your mind identify with any example, you will perforce, you will of necessity then defend the position and miss seeing, in this case, let me call the parade itself, the universal as applies to man. But I was going to point out again, I was trying to drag in two subjects at once tonight, having to do with the universal and the local. The mind is able to make the progress that it does make in the collective of humanity by being able to deal in specifics. That's the only way it can, is by the mind being able to pick out one thing and dwell on it and to separate from everything else. That's what all science is based on. It's what all technology is based on. Well, let's say technology. Theories of science or something else, but the actual physical improvement of man's lot, the evolution of technology, is based upon the mind being able to isolate and to treat specifics in a very individual, local manner, as though that one thing is all that matters. Not that they don't think about it that way, but they must treat it that way. That's the only way that you can manipulate the environment. That's the only way that technology exists. But once you get beyond that level, I was going to show, because this is tied to this, as abstruse as it may sound at times, but this is tied to it, and perhaps this might give some more concrete example. If you accept, you're just wandering along and you hear some idea being discussed, and you take the basis of the idea, the question, you take it as being a relevant, a pertinent battlefield mentally, that you take it as being a relevant field of conflict, of intellectual combat. If you do that, that is, you listen to an idea and you go, huh, and you find that you have some reaction to it, that you have some opinion, you have some apparent feel that, An example going on now, the debate over the federal funding for the arts. Now, any sophisticated, educated person up near the front of the general parade is aware of this argument, this debate, but you may hear it discussed. You turn on television or radio and you hear, here is so-and-so who, maybe several people are debating the impending drastic federal cutting of the federal budget and funding for the arts. And maybe they have a spokesman there, some artist, somebody the head of some great museum, or even somebody on one of in the federal commission in charge of arts and the humanities. And the commentator says, well, they discussed it a few minutes, and so the commentator finally says, well, to the person on the commission, or the person in favor of the arts, after they discuss it a little while, and they bring out specific examples, some opponent to it says, well, what the hell is the government doing funding artists? All it is, it's no more than the kind of subsidies that the government offers farmers, peanut farmers, not to grow peanuts. And we give them money every year not to grow peanuts. It's not our business. It should be an open market. And why should we be funding artists? And if an artist cannot make it out in the public marketplace, if whatever his wares and his services are not worthy of enough attention and support from the public, then, let him go in another business. Let him become a peanut farmer. Anyway, they go through arguments like that, and so let's say, and the commentator turns to the supporter of federal funding for the arts and says, well, what saith ye to that? And the person, and to remind you new viewers, this has, other than verbally, nothing to do with the arts, with the federal government, nothing, but here we go. And they turn to the person who is in favor of federal funding for the arts and say, well, what do you say to that? The commentator trying to sound objective, but he may say, well, that kind of argument, that's pretty, convincing from one view, that why should the government be subsidizing an artist? The supporter then will begin to defend this exact example, that is, federal funding for the arts, that they have taken the question as being valid, as being a pertinent intellectual field of combat. And once you take the question, however it's presented, it could be the arts, it could be any number of things, almost any example that you hear out in the intellectual world. If you take up any position, if you find just the argument to be on valid intellectual ground, then it is a battleground, because the only reason you're going to get interested in is there's some conflict going on already. And if you find the question itself to be a valid battleground, you will of necessity defend a local position. That is, you'll begin to defend some specific example. And the example will be tied into whatever the question is, and then you will not see. You become blinded. You become oblivious to any to the universal backdrop upon which all of this is played out. So they turn to the person in favor of federal funding for the arts and say, well, what do you say about this? Why should the government, why should us taxpayers, the commentator just trying to repeat or playing the devil's advocate, is saying, well, why should us taxpayers be taxed? Why should we be forced to pay money for some art, some painter, his efforts, some sculptor's efforts, and we may not like what he does. He may not be our particular school, part of our school, our favorite school of painting, or we may not even like art. Why should we have our tax money taken away from us to pay for the arts? I mean, that's getting pretty heavy if this conversation was serious. What if it was more than theoretical? It could be before a House or a Senate committee considering a bill to cut, to eradicate federal funding of the arts. And so some senator, let's say it's not just an objective commentator, I'm just trying to make it even sound more pressing, and they ask somebody there speaking in favor of continued federal funding of the arts, and the senator says, hey, why should taxpayers be forced to pay for art? I may not like the art. And the person goes, well, okay. And so they will answer, and it can be put in a myriad of ways, the same question over and over, and they'll continue to respond and defend the arts. What will they never point out? Remind you one more time, because some of you are going to think this is a punchline to the question of funding for the arts, and it does not have skunk smell to do with the arts, with government, with taxes. The person, as sincerely, as seriously, as heartfelt, to the same degree that they are involved in favor of the arts, they will listen to this, and they understand this is a serious attack. This assault cannot be brushed aside lightly. When someone says, Madam, sir, why is it that you think us taxpayers should have forcibly our money taken from us, our taxes be taken from us to fund the arts? What is that? What does a painting, what does a sculptor have to do with my hard-earned money? Whew. And the person has to think, well, then they have to go into all of these defenses about how the art, even to those who may at the literal level believe that they are no great lovers thereof, but how the arts indirectly, perhaps even subconsciously, enriches the human spirit, helps ennoble man's aspirations. They draw this, and people in the back of the parade, people near the middle of the parade, are thinking, God, that's terrible. What kind of answer is that? But there it sits, someone with a nice suit, dress, academic credentials, good accent, sound as though they spent a few years perhaps at Harvard or Oxford. And they're making this argument, and they bring in names of great artists, they have a good vocabulary, but if you listen, the defense is almost no defense. They have to keep saying, well, what the arts actually mean. But why should us taxpayers have our money forcibly taken from us to fund this sort of thing? Well, it's easy to overlook the enrichment that the arts, even when you're not aware of it, give to everyday life. Give even to the common man. Give to those simple people in rural areas who may never get to the large urban areas and visit great museums and see fine works of art. And the more people listen, they go, ooh-wee. What never happens? The person responding in this example, which is just one example, I could be discussing religion, I could be discussing science, technology, sports, the franchises in every city. But in this case, the defender of the arts, what do they never say? This is not the punchline you think it is, because this is not the point. They never say, in response to the senator, the accuser, asking them, why? Explain to me why I should have my taxes forcibly taken away from me to fund some piece of sculpture that looks like crap. I can't even tell what the hell that means. What you never hear is someone respond and say, well, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know whether you agree, as far as I'm concerned, of the taxes, of the money forcibly taken from me every year, what it fuels, I don't agree with 99% of it. Which is a fact. with most people. Remember, I'm not talking about taxes. But you understand they cannot, it never occurs to them to turn around and go, well, why are you picking on the arts? I hear what you're saying, but hey, 50% of the money they take from me every year, which is up in the high figures, a sizable percentage of the money I work for, over 50% of it goes to the military, and I'm a pacifist. What the hell am I going to do about it? Why are you picking on the arts? It amounts to 1% or 0.5% of the federal budget. 60% of it goes to the military. I don't like, as far as the military, all we need is about 100 guys with blackjacks, a $300 9mm, the way the things are now, and we can wipe out the rest of the world. And if we can't, to hell with it. We're going to be dead anyway. They're taking 60 cents out of every dollar they take of mine. It's spent on that kind of crap. So generals can walk around all this fancy stuff and bands play for the president and all that. Why aren't you picking on that? You understand? Because in one view that shut them up. But remember, that's not the point of this. That is not the point. The point is, if you let your mind accept the conflicts that life produces, that men seem to, the society seems to, the conflicts, the serious pressing questions, if you let your mind accept it as being, which your mind's going to accept it naturally, some part of it, but if you go along and entertain, if you tolerate your mind accepting certain arguments as being relevant, you will end up tied to local examples. You will end up defending one or the other, and no position is defensible. Or the more defensible it is, the blinder you are, because you end up trying to defend that, which is what I was trying to do by people begin to think outside the argument. They begin to think, God, this smells. Or, it is failing, because all defenses ultimately fail if you're not involved with it. And if you are involved with it, you're even worse off, because you, of necessity, will defend a local position. That is, you will defend the arts, and you can't even take it as far as going, wait a minute, rather than me defend the arts, let me ask you, the person that attacking the funding of the arts, the person say, which will never happen, they say, rather than me defending this local position of the arts, let me ask you on a wider level, why aren't you upset about 99% of what the government spends money on? Which the person would. If you ask the same kind of reasonable person, they go, well, you're right. You can't have that kind of silence in the halls of Congress. You can't have that kind of meaningful, necessary friction in the intellectual world of ordinary man come to a halt. It draws too close. It runs the extreme risk of men beginning to see outside of local examples.